So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce our new lecturer for climate change and development. In fact, the old title is the challenges of development in the light of climate change. And if you have followed us, you know that we have a website where we post and we curate our lectures. We have done one lecture a term, pretty much throughout the COVID era. And we are so happy this time that we were able to have two face-to-face. So maybe some of you were with us a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when we received Narasi Rao, sorry. And so you need to look at the website. You need to look at all the posts, all the curated events that the students have organized around our lectures to really appreciate the way we build up this reflection by including as many voices as possible. And people who have very different kind of disciplinary backgrounds and also who have different professional experience of engaging with the issues of international development and climate change. So we are so happy that Professor Melissa Leach could join us today, because I cannot think of anyone else who from a very early point in her career was already thinking about how environment and development need to be looked at, not just in scholarly terms, but also in terms of the policy implications, and who with the very pioneer center that she and her colleagues created at IDS, STEPS, have really tackled those issues in ways that have been very inspiring for many of us in this country and all around the world. And someone for us in our series we absolutely wanted is someone who has taken leadership at the level of university education and at the level of science and policy at the international level. And this is where I think Melissa's experience is very important. So I'm not going to go for a very rich and distinguished curriculum vitae. I will just want to focus on the leading role she played in the International Science Council, because to us, this is a very important example of how scholarly research can create bridges and dialogues in terms of sustainability, in terms of thinking about the environment and development, with a lot of other scholars around the world and inspiring young scholars to do more interdisciplinary work. And so you can go on the website as well. Melissa was a founding fellow of this very distinguished organization, which has a lot of papers and a lot of reflections, and also tries to create a network of young scientists who can take those issues into the future. So thank you very much. We're very much looking forward to your lecture.
Okay. Laura, thank you so much. And it's a delight to be here and to be here in person. I think I was last in this room for the anthropology conference about 4 years ago. And of course, directing IDS, I feel that we're a kind of sister institution to ODID here. And so it's lovely to have the chance to speak today, both about development in an era of climate change challenges, but also I think the points that I really want to drive home are actually more about how international development studies and perhaps the particular take on development studies that I want to share with you is so important to understanding and acting on and engaging with climate and environmental change. So that's really my kind of argument today, and I've chosen to pitch it around some ideas and some examples around climate and environmental justice and why it matters and what we might do about it. So this is my title, and I sort of come into this with a particular moment. I mean, I think we're all aware that climate change and biodiversity loss are currently being pitched as existential global challenges for the world. They're right at the top of scientific and policy and public and media concern. And there are plenty of figures and big reports to justify that concern. So we can look to climate change and the IPCC's report on the physical state of climate change and the real dangers that we won't actually be able to keep global warming between under 1.5 degrees. We can also look to biodiversity, which I will be suggesting is very connected with climate change in a number of different ways, and see there that IPBES in its latest report has talked about the major dangers and drivers of unprecedented loss of biodiversity, the sixth extinction that we're supposedly in. And these come together in, I think, some very significant narratives of crisis, of threat, of urgency, of dangers that are going to affect everybody everywhere, of shrinking spaces for the kind of development of good change that people have wanted to have wherever they might be. And we're seeing in that context some big emphases on really urgent solutions. And I think these have a number of things in common. One is that we're seeing a lot of emphasis on targets, targets for climate change around net zero, for instance, climate targets for biodiversity. So we've got the High Action Coalition now arguing that 30% of the planet of ecosystems should be protected by 2030. On the back of the Half Earth movement, which was arguing just a few years ago that half the Earth should be set aside for wild species and biodiversity. We get the crossover between the two of them in this new generation of so-called nature-based solutions, good for climate change and biodiversity loss, or indeed in the kind of target approaches that we're seeing likely to be really come to the fore when China hosts the Biodiversity Conference of the Parties later this year, where their approach to ecological redlining in China is about targets for areas are quite likely to become part of what the world is expected to take on board by one of the biggest geopolitical enactments. So we're seeing targets. Those are often founded on spatial separations between development and places for people and places for nature. Technologies to drive those, whether it's around energy transitions or technologies to see and spatialize the world and divide it up, and markets to sell nature to save it, which is something I'm going to come on to later. A lot of this is aimed at transforming social ecological systems, to use that language, to keep within what many Earth system scientists have argued is a set of planetary boundaries that define a safe operating space for humanity. I think it's also worth noting at this point that there's a lot less attention and indeed finance on adaptation for people who are already living the sharp end of these kinds of loss, let alone loss and damage for the people who've already experienced loss and damage. That's part of the global politics of justice that kind of underlines my talk. But my emphases are actually slightly different today. What I want to focus on is absolutely not to suggest that this climate and environmental emergency doesn't exist. Certainly, I'm not suggesting that climate change or biodiversity loss are not real. I'm not suggesting they're not major problems, and I'm not delving into the details of the biophysical evidence and debates about those. But what I do want to suggest is that what is often presented to us as a biophysical crisis is actually more a crisis of justice, and that we need to attend really seriously to this and to the socioeconomic and political processes which underlie that crisis, if we're to understand the causes and the character of the problems at stake, and if we're to see what to do about them, in a sense, the pathways of change, of interventions that might actually work. And my sort of sub-argument is that development studies, or international development as you call it here, is incredibly well placed to do this because of a number of emphases that have always been part of international development scholarship and practice. Interdisciplinarity, not just between the social and the natural sciences, but actually sometimes bringing social science-led approaches to the fore. A focus always on equality and equity. That key question about who gains and who loses is, I think, at the heart of development studies, or it always should be. The kind of attention to politics and power that I imagine runs through all of your studies, or certainly should do. That sense of normativity. Development studies isn't just about describing the world, it's actually about a position on what should be, on what ought to be. It's a kind of moral discipline that tries to work towards change for the better. And that means it sometimes involves engaging critically with what's happening already, with what the development industry or the environmental version of it might do. And these days, we're increasingly talking about decolonizing development, something I'll come back to a bit later. And something that's always been very close to the way I've approached it is to recognize that there are multiple diverse framings, ways of understanding and representing the world that need to be allowed to coexist in a world that, to use Arturo Escobar's phrase, is not a universe, it's a pluriverse. So I think these things are all part of development studies. And I think for that reason, I'm going to argue that climate change is an obvious development studies topic. Climate change and environmental change needs contemporary development studies as never before. But put the other way round, development studies can actually advance its own agendas, or this kind of agenda, through climate and environmental change as a lens, because it really sharpens some of these major challenges and matters of justice that are for them. So what I'm going to do now is talk about three, in a sense, areas of conceptual work that have informed this argument and the way I've come to think about climate and environmental justice. And then to give three kind of case studies which illustrate aspects of that, and then come to some conclusions and implications for all of us, I hope. So of my sort of three conceptual areas, the first is history, environment and development histories. And all of these, as Laura's sort of introduced the way that my work has often developed with colleagues at IDS, in the STEP Centre, and indeed in the African settings, which is mostly where I've worked as an anthropologist. And this is absolutely the case with each of these three areas. So the first is a long-standing interest I've had in how patterns of thinking, institutional structures, flows of money and resources in climate and environmentally related development are deeply shaped by the legacies of colonisation and coloniality. We only have to recognise that sustainability, that term we throw around, was first coined in an environmental context by a German forester in the 18th century to prescribe how forests should be managed for commercial exploitation on a long-term basis. And indeed, that early emphasis on conserving economically valuable resources has always remained a key part, I think, of the agenda. Certainly the agenda that emerged during imperial and colonial expansion, consolidated often in colonial and post-colonial periods. And so we saw, as European colonization expanded and as extractivist practices spread out across the world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, a number of social consequences that unfolded. They were often pretty devastating. They were often accompanied by slavery or by pretty difficult labor practices, racialized forms of discrimination, and often the seizing of land and livelihoods from local women and men. And so we've had feminist scholars like Anna Singh and Donna Haraway writing of the plantation scene, showing that this sort of scientifically managed plantations of the colonial period, its focus on timber and rubber crops, undermined biodiversity, supported indentured labor, supported forms of dispossession, and often in their terms patriarchal supremacy. But alongside that kind of widespread exploitative destruction, colonial environmentalism very much included this parallel aesthetic and desire, a moral urge in a way to preserve what was often seen as an untouched and imagined pristine nature in a wilderness in the so-called tropics. So whether we're looking to Richard Grove's pioneering work around green imperialism and the imagination of islands that caught colonial desires, or the invention of green colonialism, as William Blanc has just put it in this recent book, in African park settings. We've often seen this urge to protect, which has transferred over into modern day forms of fortress protectionist conservation, where large tracts of land are fenced off from local people who are then imagined as the destroyers of those, labeled sometimes as primitive or uncivilized or unmodern, in ways that justify their removal or expulsion or restriction or re-education. And I think these legacies still abound today, even though the borders and the leaders may well have changed, and the justifications may now be in terms of so-called climate-compatible development or nature-based solutions. But some of those histories of dispossession still exist. So that's one kind of legacy. And I've been also very interested, as my cases will show, in the clashes between the kinds of versions of history that support these colonial legacy practices and the different versions of history that often emerge if one looks to more local narratives of the people who are often the blamed victims in these ones. So that then relates to my sort of second conceptual area, which has emerged from the work that Laura mentioned that I did with colleagues in the STEP Centre from the mid-2000s, really up until now. And the STEPS has just moved into its, I think, 16th year in a legacy centre, which is now called Future Natures, run by my colleague Amber Hartford Ideas. But what we've argued in STEPS is that we can always see human and environmental change as co-developing, they're mutually entwined. You can talk about that as social ecological systems. I often prefer the term assemblage, which is a bit less systematic, or even the term socio-natures, which gets at that conceptual and lived intertwining. But the point is that these assemblages change over time along what we in STEPS call pathways, different directions of intervention and change, which can move one towards or away from sustainability, which is itself defined in different ways according to who you are and where you are. And these pathways are always entwined with power. They're also very often underpinned by narratives, storylines, with quite clear beginnings, middles, and ends about how the way things were, about the ways they're unfolding now, and what one needs to do to put them back on track. And I've been very interested in the ways that different narratives are created differently by particular institutions. They assign responsibility and blame differently, and they underpin and justify certain kinds of action. But in doing that, they also hide, they also occlude and marginalize perhaps other forms of action, which may support slightly different interests. So I've often asked, as I will do in these cases today, whose narratives and whose pathways come to count? And this is a little diagram I created with Kate Rayworth, actually, who is here in Oxford now, and has linked the notion of planetary boundaries to social boundaries and the idea of the social floor, and suggested that there's a safe and just operating space that pathways need to move in. But I've sort of added some of these red bits to it to say, actually, there's power and questions of choice which happen all the way through these. Which pathways? Who towards which goals, sustainability of what for whom, and who gains or who loses from the way these pathways unfold. So this then brings us to my third sort of conceptual area, which is around how we think about justice, and particularly climate and environmental justice. Now, huge area. You might say, what am I doing standing in one seminar trying to talk about justice when we've got many centuries of social science and humanities work and its activist traditions, which the overlap with questions about inequality and equity and all kinds of things. But I think it's worth doing, and I think it's worth drawing attention to, because if we shirk the challenge, we actually don't get very far. So I've been interested, first of all, in the way that justice has both pragmatic and moral emphases to it. that we can distinguish between different kinds of justice. You might think about distributive justice, which refers to the way that goods and bads get allocated between different groups or across society or across different places. We can also think about procedural justice, which refers much more to decision-making processes, the kind of thing that always happens in development. Are they fair? Are they accountable? Who do they work in favour of? And that links up with a lot of fundamental development questions about participation process, who gets to represent who. And then there's this term recognitional justice, which was brought into the lexicon, I think most clearly by Nancy Fraser, who argues that actually we need to recognise difference and the identity claims of certain groups to be part of those processes. And that sometimes injustice can happen simply because people don't get a seat at the table, and their claims never get to be recognised at all. And then in relation to environment, lots of people, of course, have been talking about intergenerational justice, which can be distributive, procedural, or recognitional, actually, but focuses in on this key question around environment, about whether the legacy passed to the next generation preserves the options and the quality that current generations have enjoyed. So if we're thinking about justice, there's a big overlap with thinking about equity, where as part of the International Science Council a few years ago, colleagues and I were the academic leads for the World Social Science Report, which suggested that we need to think about equity in multidimensional terms. Yes, it's economic and political, but it's also social and spatial and cultural and knowledge-based. And actually, these multiple dimensions often interact with each other. And some of those ideas were picked up in the Human Development Report in 2020, which looked at human development in the Anthropocene in this context of human environmental challenges, and suggested that a multidimensional version of equity and justice was needed if we were to understand development processes in that Anthropocene context. One way of linking those up is a paper that I did with colleagues in Future Earth, where we suggested that the multidimensional equity bit comes in the middle of this diagram here. You can ask equity of what and between whom, and then round the edge, we add in those distributional, procedural, and recognition elements. And so if one wants to think about equity and sustainability, this is a kind of little mini conceptual framework which helps one. But bringing all of this into the environment and climate justice field, there's of course been a lot of work that has tried to do exactly that, and we only need to go back. Well, we can go back further, but the first notions of sustainable development in a modern context in Broadlands in 1987 was, of course, all about intergenerational justice, and this idea that sustainable development was about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. We've also had these environmental justice traditions often coming out of activist work and racial justice, particularly in the US. We've got debates now about just transitions, which I think focus particularly on distributional justice and arguing that in moves to low carbon economies or sustainability transitions in other areas, one needs to think hard about who gains or who loses and make sure that those potentially at the bottom of the pile don't lose out on livelihoods of work or employment, as often occurs. We can ask questions about cognitive justice, as I often have, saying that we need to address knowledge inequalities and the role sometimes of indigenous knowledges and plural knowledges in shaping debates. And then we come to climate justice, which is being understood in a multitude of ways at the moment. Some focusing in on the causes and consequences of climate change, others on ways to tackle it. And I particularly like some of this recent work on transformative climate justice, which goes beyond those immediate questions of distribution to ask about the structural causes and power relations which underlie those, and suggesting that transformative climate justice approaches, as Tasneem Jaffrey is arguing here from her Glasgow Centre, need to address this responsibility that falls on the poorest and most vulnerable, and actually needs to get to the root causes of change. So we can get into that anywhere we like. My bottom line is that really a notion of pathways supported by narratives can work towards or away from justice, conceptualized in these different dimensions. And I'm interested in how equity and justice play out both in relation to climate and environmental change itself, but also in relation to the pathways and interventions which might be undertaken to address it, because those two are important. And we're seeing these days injustices perpetuated in the interests of tackling climate and environmental change, as well as in the causes and playing out of those changes themselves. So let's look at some cases which I hope will ground some of this. And I've got three here. I'll make an apology in advance that they're all focusing on low and middle income countries, not because climate change and environmental change are not problems in the UK, in Europe, in the US, they fundamentally are. To me, development is universal and is relevant there. But these are examples which I have to hand from the work of colleagues, and they illustrate quite nicely some of the points that I want to make. They're also all rural. The first starts really with a focus more on adaptation, and the second move to questions of mitigation as well. Although I think local experiences and climate change debates themselves increasingly blur those distinctions. So, okay, all right. So, first example comes from the Sundarbans, the Bay of Bengal, this area which crosses India and Bangladesh, where IDS colleagues, Lina Mehta and others have been working with local partners in the Tapestry project. And this area is home to the largest mangrove forest in the world. It's recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site because of its ecological and indeed its cultural significance. But it's also seen to be one of the most vulnerable areas of the Indian subcontinent and a hotspot for climate change because of these frequent disasters that affect it. There have been cyclones, including Alia, which hit the region in 2009, storm surge flooding, climate stressors, sea level rise, which is often leads this very volatile landscape. Islands disappear, and you get these extreme temperature and rainfall patterns. And livelihoods in this area, which have often been based on paddy cultivation, shrimp farming, are suffering. And there are problems, particularly for women, who are being disproportionately affected by those livelihood problems. And their vulnerabilities increased at the same time as they're often having to play a more critical role in sustaining families. So this is a place, though, where the dominant narrative is of climate change-induced turbulence. And as a result, the dominant solutions have focused on plans mostly for infrastructure, things like concrete embankments, very much led by the state, and backed by this idea that you've got fundamentally a climate problem happening. Now, clearly, climate change effects are playing into what's going on here. But as the Tapestry project and as the fantastic PhD work of Camilla Dewan has recently shown, this rather singular climate change narrative is actually a misreading of an area with a history of political and economic marginalisation and exploitation, which has over the last couple of hundred years and intensifying in the last couple of decades, faced numerous economic as well as ecological uncertainties. So in Bangladesh, you've had commercial interest in shrimp farming, which have really played into what's been happening to sea level rises and saline incursion into its paddylands. You've had conservation efforts in India and in Bangladesh, which have contributed to unequal growth patterns in the region. Poverty and malnutrition have remained very high, but it's been in response to that agrarian crisis and its economic triggers and the lack of employment that in turn out-migration has become a serious problem. And that in turn has negatively affected islanders' sense of identity and the cohesion that's often been felt amongst these, a very plural society with Muslims, Hindus and so-called tribals who have been united in their veneration of a goddess called Bondi who links them together around ways of living with nature. So it's been a multiple set of vulnerabilities and challenges. And actually in response to a recognition of that multiplicity and the uncertainties that local people have been living with and actually managing with for some time, that we've begun to see now alliances of NGOs and scientists and Sundarbans dwellers themselves who've started to challenge these state-dominated climate alone development trajectories and focusing much more on what can be done to support livelihoods while easing pressure on some of the natural resources. So instead of these top-down solutions and the concrete embankments that actually now some scientists show might end up being maladaptive in the long term, we've got other things going on. So Sega block in India and Shamnagar block in Bangladesh, there are hybrid innovations around wetland agriculture and fishing, new varieties of paddy cultivation to be resistant to saline and brackish water, new forms of crab farming and aquaculture, which link vegetable growing and fish farming, which have all helped to enhance people's livelihood security and well-being locally, help to support a more long-term approach to adapting to climate and economic uncertainties, while also countering some of these livelihood problems. And various marginalised groups like small farmers and young people have now found a way and a reason perhaps to stay in this area. They've gained some new skills and there have been some positive impacts on women as well. And I think working across both countries, certainly local scientists are arguing, provides a possibility for regional transformation in a way that is transcending some of the political boundaries between India and Bangladesh in this bay around challenges. So perhaps some positive stories emerging, but a different approach to dealing with climate change, or one that's supporting local justice in many different dimensions. Well, we can move from there to my second example, which comes from West Africa. And this so-called Great Green Wall in the Sahel, what a wonderful term. What this really is a Pan-African ecological restoration and local development project that has been under implementation across these 11 countries of the Sahel since 2008. And again, the dominant narrative which has shaped it is one around climate-induced desertification. But it goes back much further than current concerns with anthropogenic climate change. Because this idea of the drying out of the Sahel, its desertification, is centuries old. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, many Western settlers who explored these arid territories to the south of the Sahara attributed droughts to the divine punishment of indigenous fisher people. But it was from the 18th century onwards, and particularly in the 19th century, as part of colonial expansion, that the narrative of Sahelian droughts as linked to negative local practices, to overgrazing, to felling of trees for firewood, to setting fire, to shifting cultivation by Sahelian farmers and pastoralists, gradually took hold. And from that time, there was a discourse of desertification and desiccation that made it possible to legitimize colonial control, particularly by the French colonial authorities and the British ones in between, over territories which had previously been managed by local populations. There's a narrative of desertification. And it was extended south into the forest savanna ecotone and the border areas of the so-called Great Pristine Forest to the south by colonial foresters like Oberville, shown here on the right, who in the 1930s argued that the great forests of West Africa were threatened by the southward spread of the desert, the migration southwards of so-called savanna people, who would gradually destroy the forests. And he argued for the creation of a curtain of forest reserves in the northern fringes of the Big Upper Forest Block, which was indeed put in place and underlaid the creation of colonial forest reserves at that time. Now, what's happened since in the last few decades is a growing consensus that actually local land use is not and has never been the cause of Sahelian droughts, which don't originate in the land. They originate in the oceans and in ocean temperature patterns and effects on rainfall. There's also a growing consensus that actually the long-term climate trajectory in the whole of West Africa is actually about rehumidification. And actually these forests, if anything, are spreading north under a long-term trajectory of increasing rainfall over the last 500 years. Now, we can talk about that further, but it's also the case that the Sahel has actually been in a greening phase since about 1980. Now, there are new instabilities that anthropogenic climate change is bringing about, and there can be local feedback effects with climate. But what we haven't got going on here is climate change-induced desertification. Nevertheless, we have got the Great Green Wall, but this is interesting because it began very much as an African, a pan-African initiative with a lot of local diversity and implementation. It started in 2005 at a summit of leaders of heads of state of these Sahelian countries, and was initially led by Nigerian President Obasanjo, and the Senegalese president at the time took leadership as part of the environmental component of what was then the new Partnership for African Development. And the early implementation was very, very decentralized. It was about countries doing their own thing and often putting in place local tree planting projects, very often delivered by communities, and as in these examples here of Senegal, often carried out with local people with livelihood benefits around the edge. So a lot of the Senegalese forestry was highly participatory and allowed women very often to plant vegetable crops as intercrop rows between your lines of trees. And so, and it also was coupled with activities that allowed people to harvest straw between the trees and so on. So there was some local benefit. This was certainly a very localized project. But what's rather fascinating is how, amidst current global climate change concerns, this has actually changed very dramatically. So in January 2021, the third One Planet Summit was convened, organized by France, and involved in the United Nations and the World Bank. And in Paris, Emmanuel Macron suddenly began to urge urgent action. And at that forum, the so-called Great Green Wall Accelerator Initiative was launched. And in his concluding speech, Macron began, very interestingly, by recalling France's investment in the security and stability of the Sahel, a region which he argued was weakened by terrorism. He then turned to the ecological challenges, desertification and global warming, and stated that all of these challenges could find a common solution in the Great Green Wall, but that for the past 15 years, this Great Green Wall had had its ups and downs. It now needed Western investment to move into a new game-changing, accelerated phase. So the One Planet Summit led to a lot of private investment, which suddenly, through the accelerator, argued that by 2030, there was going to be 100 million hectares of degraded land sort of repaired. And then 6 months later, Jeff Bezos recently returned from his space trip, pledged a $1 billion donation, adding to what had already been contributed, which was 15 billion. And then at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, by that stage, the sum rose again to 19 billion. So we've now got an accelerated initiative. If those $19 billion were actually invested in the Great Green Wall, distributed evenly perhaps among the 11 states, this accelerator project would inject more than $1.5 billion into each country, and $1.5 billion in Senegal alone. That's about 100 times what was invested between 2008 and 2019. And as Tor Benjaminson has recently pointed out, it's not just the scale, but actually the discourse that's now surrounding the Great Green Wall. This is very, very different, because this has moved from being an African initiative to what's being now pitched as an exceptional opportunity for Western leaders to demonstrate their interest in the environment at a time when they haven't been able to and are now able to avoid the implementation of drastic and unpopular measures in their own countries. So while they can't limit global warming at home, they can now claim to do so by investing massively in the Great Green Wall elsewhere. Moreover, I think the kinds of statements we saw from Macron and indeed from Bezos and others present them as it were, the leaders of the accelerator. Very, very different from the original conception of this as a Pan-African project. So I think what we're really seeing is a recolonization of a once African initiative. It's also one where its speed contrasts drastically, actually, with the realities of life in the Sahel, the timescale of ecological restoration, where it takes at least 10 to 15 years for indigenous tree species to grow, and the timescales experienced by local populations in their engagements with society and nature, which are both seasonal and generational. They're multi-timescales, which do not overlap with this acceleration. And then what, of course, is also occluded by these quick accelerated narratives, and especially the ways they're extended down into the forest zone, is the connected lives and ways of living with natures in these ecologies. In the Sahel, this is about how pastoralists live with their ecological uncertainty. We overlook ways in which actually grasslands are quite good at fixing carbon as well as supporting populations. Or if we move into the forest savanna version of it a bit further south, we've got very similar policy narratives, and particularly the idea that the patches of forest one finds in this forest savanna dynamic being the last relics of this forest destroyed by the southward march of the savanna and the deserts above. Very much contradicting the kind of localized experience that my own work with James Fairhead has shown over a number of decades actually now, through which villagers actually build forest islands in savanna. These rings around villages are not the last relics of the great forest. They're actually the outposts of advancing forest, created through settlement histories and everyday life, a mixture of intentionality and just what happens when people live with these dynamic ecologies. And all of this is overlooked by these particular narratives of one-way climate change. So if I move to my third example, of course, part of the Great Green Wall narrative and its salience amidst current climate change concern is that planting trees fixes carbon. It can be therefore seen as part of a nature-based solution to climate change and part of contributions to global climate change mitigation through this idea that schemes to conserve or indeed enhance forest carbon in one place by planting trees can offset emissions elsewhere, either directly or more particularly through the generation of carbon credits that can then be sold in carbon markets. So what we have going on here is both in current times a new valuing or a revaluing of forests, which have always been valued as extractive for all sorts of extractive purposes, now for their carbon value. and a new generation of carbon forestry projects as part of what's now being seen as an economy, not just of protection, but actually of repairing nature. So the premise also is about bringing the market in, big time. So environmental crises in this view are seen to arise because nature is neglected in a market economy. It's sort of seen as an externality which isn't properly valued. So the solution, it follows, is to correct these market failures through market expansion. So we can create new markets for carbon, new financial instruments, new commodities that will bring previously unpriced and therefore assumed undervalued aspects of nature into the market gaze. That's what Kathleen McAfee termed about a decade ago, selling nature to save it. It's now very much seen as being part of creating future growth and delivering win-win solutions in the present, while neutralizing, repairing, restoring, or replacing elements of the natural world that have been harmed or destroyed by extractive and industrial globalization. So we're not just in an economy of protection now, we're in an economy of repair. And the voluntary carbon markets are a real classic example of this repair mode in practice, allowing governments, corporations, and even private consumers a means to compensate for or neutralize their own greenhouse gas emissions through consuming carbon offsets, often issued as certificates that represent a claim to quantified units of environmental impact assessed in terms of pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is really prominent. I mean, I'm sure as you all know, in climate policy and corporate social responsibility in public discourse. And I think we're now seeing not just markets for carbon, but actually boutiques for carbon. And that's a term that my colleague Amber Huff has used, where some of the boutique aspects are about the win-wins, that these are not just about carbon offsets, they also do other things. They benefit local people. It's a boutique shop window. This example, I think here from Shell's nature-based solutions, local people get 70% of the benefit, is a boutique example. Now, there's understandably been a lot of environment and development which has been engaging quite critically with these narratives around forest carbon and offsetting. It's pointed out lots of things, including this pretty tenuous connection, contingent connection with actual emissions reductions. In a sense, what offsets do is to move the problem around rather than tackling carbon emissions at source, one might argue. The basic global injustice that one might point out between the cause of the problems of climate change lying in industrialized countries and systems, yet the responsibility for the solution being offloaded onto other places and people in places elsewhere. And then the many, many challenges and real difficulties in creating and sustaining what's been identified as a central fiction at the heart of these carbon markets. This idea that 1 ton of carbon dioxide is always commensurate or equivalent to another elsewhere and always exchangeable, no matter how or where in the world it's sequestered or emitted. And that, of course, isn't really the case, as we'll see. But a lot of work and methods and techniques have to come into play to create and sustain that fiction, to create what in Polanyi's terms might be the fictitious commodity of carbon. Carbon isn't a real commodity. It's not a thing like timber or a bit of wood or a mineral. It's a virtual commodity. It's also, as again Amber Huff has coined another nice phrase, a frictitious commodity because of the contested versions of its commodity or non-commodity status. And colleagues and I, in another project that emanated from the STEP Centre in 2015-16, have been particularly interested in how these measurement techniques in turn construct particular narratives about landscape, especially things like the ways that the so-called baseline scenario, what's deemed to be going to happen to a forest without a carbon project, And it has to be shown to be going to be lost. Otherwise, the project itself isn't additional and doesn't actually sequester carbon. So there's this whole kind of, it's a bit of a circuitous argument, whereby accrediting your project, you have to show that there's a trajectory going on of forest loss that then you're halting, which in turn is often justified by creating a history, the idea that forest has been being lost in the past, and that therefore your project is stopping this trajectory, which is continuing into the future. All kinds of squirming that goes on, which runs very much against the real environmental histories that often emerge. And the second methodological move is actually about manageability, because it's incredibly complicated to measure and prove additionality in carbon projects in these mixed, complicated socio-natures where people's livelihoods and settlements and patches of forest and non-forest and savanna and trees mixed up with farms actually are. So it's much easier to return to big block type forest conservation and actually to justify a return to that fortress conservation, which had kind of become a thing of the past. So very quickly, so I'm getting a little bit over time. Can I take another 5 minutes just to run through these two cases, which I think show both the frictions quite neatly. So I've looked at two projects so I've lost my control. Both in Sierra Leone, which is a country where I've worked a great deal over many decades. And just quickly, what is going on in each of them? In both of these are long-term environment development conservation projects, which in the last decade have turned to climate and carbon justification to try and raise money to add to their other environmental goals. So the Western Area Peninsula Forest, just near on the Freetown Peninsula, just above the city, was always a project about trying to protect the watersheds that protect the city's water supply. But in their turn to carbon, there was suddenly a need to both fence off this forest, which was a place where people had harvested, well, people had done a certain amount of farming, they'd harvested timber and building supplies for boats for the fishing industry and for local housing. And suddenly much of that was stopped because those things were deemed to be incompatible with carbon sequestration and the needing to keep big bulky trees there. And the process through which that happened was one which very much didn't respect any of these aspects of justice or equity along the top, either the recognition of the people and groups who have different kinds of rights and interests in the forest and identities associated with them, or the procedural equity one might have looked for in how this scheme was designed, or therefore the distributional equity in how resources and benefits and burdens were distributed. What we ended up with was carbon credits being sold usually to diamond corporations to offset what they were doing, and the shutting out of the ability of people to harvest resources that they depended on. But what became quite fascinating was how the people living around this forest came to make sense of what was going on as this forest that they'd always understood as somewhere that outsiders and foreigners were interested in, is now being valued for carbon. And some of these forms of sense making were fascinating, actually, and very creative. So in one of them, a man said, WACFOR, which is the project, said to come out from the bush because they need carbon in other countries. So they need to buy it. They need to buy the bush. Well, that's actually a fairly sensible way of making sense of this idea of buying up forests now for this thing called carbon. But the one I love most of all was this idea that RED, which one will probably know is the acronym for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, was actually a person. So this was a woman who said, we've been told that when RED comes, he's going to buy the bush. The idea that RED's kind of this guy, maybe someone who read who was going to come and actually buy it all up. And what seems to be going on here, it kind of inverts the idea of a fictitious commodity. because while carbon project developers are going through these methodological shenanigans to construct carbon as a fictitious commodity which can then be traded, you've got local residents who are interpreting carbon just like other kinds of commodities. It's something that's there in a tree, it's there in the bush. It's really a bit like diamonds or timber that foreigners want to come and extract. A repeated theme in Sierra Leone's history, but actually turning a narrative of a fictitious commodity back into a real commodity in a way that also reflects on the history of exploitation. And then the other project, which is actually happening in and around the village where I've lived on and off since the late 1980s, where the Gola Forest, once a place of ancestral legacy and villages that people used to visit and where people used to hunt, it first became a biodiversity hotspot in a project run by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds from the 1990s, and then has become funded as another carbon project, adding to its biodiversity concerns, and is being touted as a super duper boutique nature-based solution. And it's boutique in the sense that, again, there are many arguments about local involvement in this project. And people don't mind it much. The reason they don't mind it is because this forest has been so long out of the purview of everyday livelihoods and the farming and the gardening that happens around its edge. And actually, frankly, people haven't got the labor now to go into the forest for long-term hunting or even to fell the big trees there. So they're kind of living around the edge, but they don't get very much benefit from it either. It exists as a kind of out of the way thing. In Court Barry, decorated with exotic animals, some payments for school fees. But what they are not getting is the kind of support which might be the benefit that's valued, which is support to the farming livelihoods suffering in this area from economic shocks, the price shocks of COVID, the lack of labour as young people move away to the city, and so on. So I think what we see in these examples, as I move to some implications and conclusions, both the legacy of colonial discourses, actually in all of them, and of some more recent shifts in ideas about how climate and environmental problems should be addressed. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that these colonially influenced legacies persist despite an incomplete shift from state to market-based approaches. So whereas back in an era of a colonial state, we saw narratives about local incompetence being a way of justifying territorial control, state control over commodities. We've now got market-based approaches, which frankly are doing much the same thing, but through some new discourses of commodity. But what's also happened is that environmental issues have been reframed from the way we've localized policy or regulatory failures around which you might put in place some new kinds of regulation, to things that are understood in terms of quantified global aggregates, these breach planetary boundaries, or these failures of global markets, which can then be seen as engineering or accountancy problems. And all of that has served to deepen the integration of nature into this kind of capitalist economy of repair. Now, in 2012, I worked with Ian Scoons and James Fairhead around this idea of what we called then green grabbing, a new appropriation of nature, which was coming about through an economy of repair, and as new commercial and market-based interests began to generate, often hand in hand with states, new forms of enclosure, which often appropriated nature and ways of living with nature in ways that dispossessed people of rights of livelihoods. And that's what we borrowed the term from John Vidal, who used it in The Guardian, I think, as green grabbing, and theorized it a bit. In the last couple of years, people like Andrea Brock and on behalf have built on that green grabbing idea and the idea of an economy of repair in this notion of accumulation by restoration. And I put the definition here. And what they're really arguing, and it relates to climate change in a double sense, is that on the one hand, you've got this pathway through which conventional extraction, this extensive production of nature, is taking from the land, from the sea, from the sky, resources that are feeding industrial expansion and growth. But at the very self-same time, virtual nature is being produced through these technologies of repair in the form of these new financial instruments, new forms of commodity, to feed the expansion of these new growth markets. And it's these growth markets that are promising to recreate, repair, or restore the damage caused by the industrial expansion and growth. So in a way, we've got a double process through which one is actually feeding the other. The economy of extraction is feeding the economy of repair, and the economy of repair is feeding the economy of extraction. That's quite a scary process, and it's one that's producing assorted injustices. It's also producing assorted separations and disconnections, which are dividing people more and more from these more intertwined ways of living with the non-human. So, if we were to think forward just some implications, one might want to revisit these justice questions in a way that would say, okay, let's actually try and reverse and address some of these procedural and distributive questions. One might want to argue for greater participation in policy processes, for greater recognition of different social groups, support to their rights and claims that might go along with legal empowerment, might also go along with recognition and integration of a greater diversity of knowledges and for more accountability in procedures and processes. So that's the kind of implication that one might want to argue for from a development perspective. And that in turn is going to be important if we want to think about distributive justice, ensuring that transitions or approaches to dealing with climate and environmental change, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, are actually just, that they treat and act on these different burdens and costs and potentials for benefit in a fairer way. We also will need, therefore, to address the ways in which the attempts to address environmental and climate problems can have unintended effects or perhaps overlooked effects in terms of negative consequences at different scales and amongst different people, how land and green grabs are unfolding. But in a way, I think we need to go a bit deeper than simply thinking about the procedures. And this is my last slide. And if we're really to, I think, embrace climate and environmental justice as things that matter, I think we're into a broader and far more political endeavour of actually challenging these unsustainable and unjust pathways, and rather actively appreciating and seeking out the alternatives. That is going to mean unpacking colonial legacies. It's going to mean unpacking these contemporary forms of state and market governance, and looking at the frictions that they often encounter with local people's own narratives. It's going to involve attending to plurality and the different narratives that emerge in different contexts and according to different perspectives. It's going to involve engaging with power, both material power and this politics of knowledge, this cognitive justice, as a way of perhaps opening up spaces in which one might imagine more inclusive forms of deliberation to occur. That's not always going to be easy. It's not just about getting people around a table and having just procedures. It's going to be highly political. It can, I think, be supported by alliance building between people, between groups. I think that's something that academics can become engaged in, whether as scholar activists or as those who work with social movements or with scientists and members of communities on the ground. And I think it requires a stance which, to take one back to development studies and international development, is engaged, which positions what we do as not just understanding the world, but seeking to change it by seeking out and appreciating different kinds of knowledge, by challenging the hierarchy and engaging those alternatives with those who have the power to act on the ground. So none of this is easy, but it's kind of where I've come to in thinking where some of the tasks ahead might lie. So thanks very much.